Good morning. Thanks for coming this morning. It's our great pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Melvin Peters, who's a professor of Hebrew Bible and Septuagint at Duke University. Dr. Peters did his bachelor's in religion and his master's in biblical languages at Andrews University and completed his PhD at the University of Toronto. His dissertation was entitled An Analysis of the Textual Character of the Boharik of Deuteronomy, so you Coptic fans should be interested in that. He worked with John Weavers and has spent much of his career studying the Septuagint and other related texts. I had the pleasure of meeting him in September when I went up to Toronto to Trinity Western to attend a Septuagint conference. Many of you remember Dr. Hebert, who was with us last year, and I was teaching 363 at the time and quite interested in it. They were celebrating the publication of the New English translation of the Septuagint, and actually before the conference proper began on Saturday, they had a kind of mix and mingle situation with the students at the Student Union building Friday evening, and I had the good fortune, I guess it was a fortune, to fall into a rather spirited conversation with Mel. He and some other students were talking about issues of faith and biblical studies and those kind of things. And those of you who have worked with me know that I'm fairly spirited myself. Found my match with Mel and certainly my intellectual and professional superior. We kind of interchanged a bit. I enjoyed all of the sessions the next day. He actually talked about his translation of Deuteronomy in the Nets volume. And of course, he's currently working on the commentary that will succeed that. I came back and was effusive about him to Dr. Pike. And as you know, Dr. Pike is always quite eager to bring as many people to BYU as possible to give you an exposure to the field and the work that's being done out there and kind of break out of our shell some. And so we ran into him serendipitously a couple times at SBL, and one thing led to another. Now, as we were walking over, Mel said, "Don't take my time. I have a lot to say." So without any further loquaciousness on my part, we are happy to introduce to you Dr. Melvin Peters.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and the only major challenge I'm finding right now is to cover a subject as ambitious as this in 50 minutes, or what's left of 50 minutes. But I'll give it my best shot. Now, the problem I always face when I teach younger people is that the world that I occupy, and it's getting more intense, the problem gets more intense as time goes on. My world is so much bigger than yours in terms of what you know about. So the frame within which I'd like to fit this talk comes from a line in a song by a very distinguished American popular singer. Her name is Barbara Streisand. I am presuming that you know who she is. And I'm presuming further that you would know this very popular song, Memories. Some of you know Memories? I'm being this careful because I teach 18 and 22-year-olds all the time, and I make an allusion, and they look, huh? They have no idea what I'm talking about. Well, anyway, the line in question is this. What's too painful to remember, we simply choose to forget. Now, let me situate it. Memories may be beautiful, and yet, what's too painful to remember, we simply choose to forget. So it's the laughter we remember whenever we remember the way we were. Now, the pivotal line that I'm using as the frame, the bracket for this talk, is what's too painful to remember, we simply choose to forget. Those lines apply rather aptly to the Septuagint. The Old Testament in Greek, around which today's talk, and since it's in 50 minutes, let me say lecture, will focus, is sort of painful for some people whose presuppositions about Scripture, about the Bible, require them not to have pain. The Septuagint gives witness to aspects of biblical textual history that some find a little disconcerting and inconvenient, hence that adjective in my title. But others find those very factors about the Septuagint exhilarating and challenging. I happen to fall in the latter group. But the story of the Septuagint needs to be told, and especially highlighted to students like yourself seriously interested in the ancient Near East and the Bible. That story, of course, is detailed in many publications, and the list is increasing as we go along. You have general introductions, and I'm particularly partial to a recent one by Karen Jobes and Moises Silva entitled Invitation to the Septuagint. If you need a little more intense work, and I don't normally do this because there's so much out there and somebody's going to be hurt that I didn't mention their work, but Emmanuel Tove, who is a luminary in our field, has written the text critical use of the Septuagint in biblical research, if you're interested in more advanced studies. And I would be less than charitable to myself if I did not make you aware that for a general overview you should still read, or you could read, I would invite you to read my general article in the Anchor Bible Dictionary on the Septuagint. And if you dig further, you will find other things that several other people have wrote. For the next several minutes, then, I would like to speak to you about the New English translation of the Septuagint and my role as one of the translators in that project. My friend Eric preempted my statement at this point because you know it exists now, but let me say a little bit more. It's the New English translation of the Septuagint is a more than 12-year project dedicated to translating the Old Greek into English. It involved a team of international experts, an international team of experts, of which I'm proud to have been a part. It was published, and you can see it live, or you just saw it live, late in 2007, and is widely available at a reasonable price. To find a hardcover volume at that price these days is truly remarkable. And if you are tech savvy, you can go on to any of those, what are they called, things that you go and you click and you get it, even at the discount. The volume includes, of course, not only the expected translations, but a general introduction by the editors and individual introductions to each translation unit by the translator. And these are very intimately titled. The major introduction is titled To the Reader of Nets, and each of the introductions to the respective units is titled To the Reader. So, and then we get into this very exotic Hebrew and Greek and the temptations and the tendencies of the translator. So it's really a sort of mixed message. Anyway, only 2 such translations into English before Nets had been made. The first of these was completed just over 200 years ago, in 1808. The most recent, before Nets, of course, and the most widely used was done more than 150 years ago in 1851. Neither of these translations incorporated certain books that are accepted within the canon, the corpus of the Greek Bible. Both of those translations utilized a single manuscript, a manuscript which some people think is, and I have to watch what I say here, sort of divinely inspired. That is Codex Vaticanus. It's just a manuscript. But if you have Ralph's, do you know who Ralph's is? You know, most of the things, and if you have many of the search engines, they do not have as their text for the Septuagint a critical text. They simply have Codex Vaticanus B, and people say that is the Septuagint. A little later, I'll try to demonstrate some of the complexities of making that judgment. Now then, since 1851, many more Greek manuscripts have been discovered. Their contents are reflected in our new translation. The Old Greek Bible, sometimes called the Septuagint, and we'll elaborate on that a little bit, was the first translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, arguably, and I guess I wouldn't need to argue it here, the most influential body of literature in the world. That's quite a statement, but I'll stand by it. Into another language. Now, I've chopped that sentence up. Let me read it once more. The Old Greek Bible, sometimes called the Septuagint, was the first translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, arguably the most influential body of literature in the world, into another language. That event took place in the Hellenistic period, when dispersed Jews were no longer able to speak Hebrew, but wished to have their sacred scriptures available in their vernacular tongue. The Torah, the first part translated, was done in the 3rd century. Most of us who work in the field are in agreement on that point, presumably in Alexandria, and the other two sections in the subsequent centuries. The name Septuagint derives from a now widely discredited legend surrounding this translation found in the so-called letter, it's not really a letter, but that's what most people know it as, of Aristeas, that some 70 or 72, depending on where you read, translators independently produced flawless translations of the Torah. The Hebrew from which the Old Greek Bible, the Septuagint, was translated was unmarked for vowels. Now, I just want to be sure that I'm not speaking beneath you or above you. How many people in this room read Hebrew or know Hebrew? Oh, then I can just really go for it. How about Greek? Oh, you're a good group. I can say what I planned to say then. Now, let's go on for a minute. Now, the Hebrew from which the Old Greek Bible, the Septuagint, was translated was unmarked for vowels. That is, an unvocalized text. Today, as you know, the oldest complete manuscript containing the entire Hebrew Bible, and the word complete is critical, is vocalized. It is a text with Masoretic vocalization. And on this point, I tend to get very whatever, but you'll hear my point in a minute. It dates from the 11th century, as you should know. If they don't know, don't give them a degree. 1008 CE, is held in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, now back to Leningrad, depending on what your politics are, and is the base text from which most Bible translators from Hebrew into other languages are made. I tell my undergraduates a lot, if you discovered a new language and you wanted to get the Old Testament into that language, where would you go? And routinely they are stumped. They just know that it is in Hebrew, and so I always foreground and highlight the Leningrad Codex. I like to refer to it as L. Anyway, here's my next most critical point. We do not know anything about the manuscript from which the Leningrad Codex was copied, even though it sometimes is treated as if it were an original autograph by many, both scholars and laypersons alike. As obvious as it may seem, it needs to be restated and doubly underscored that this manuscript, sometimes referred to as the Masoretic text, could not have been and was not the text from which the Old Greek translation was made. The importance and value of the Old Greek Bible, especially the first 5 books, therefore, lies in this fact. And all my undergraduates know this. And you are undergraduates and you're listening to me, you must know this. This is the fact that you cannot forget. When the Septuagint is retroverted, in my undergraduate classes I say back translated, into Hebrew, the resulting text represents at least one Hebrew manuscript that predates the oldest complete extant Hebrew manuscript by more than 1,200 years. Now that datum you should know because you're in the A&E. I always get tongue-tied on this one. In the ANES division. Now, that fact is critical because what tends to happen, as I will discuss presently, someone starts with 2 texts that appear to diverge from each other, though that in fact diverge from each other. And what you hear is the Greek corrects or the Greek adds. And the politics of that is so widespread, or the practice is so widespread, that it has become dogma almost. And I always remind people, let's get the date straight. Whatever else you say, even if you take Codex Leningrad as an autograph, the Septuagint manuscripts we have, Codex Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, etc., are 4th century. At least they predate it by several centuries. But I'm getting all worked up on this. Let me relax. I have several pages to do here. One final fact. The closer we get to the time of the events recorded in the Hebrew Bible, that is, the farther back we go from the present, the greater the divergence, that is, the differences in the written witnesses to those events. Concomitantly, the closer we are to the present, the greater the agreement in those literary witnesses. One simple example. Have you ever seen the King James Version, wherever you go in the world, with a textual variation? No, because it was. What did they do back then? They were printed. And once you get into printing, the opportunity, the possibility for corruption evaporates. Let me make this final point on this first stage of the presentation. The Septuagint, then, is but one of several witnesses to the contents of the Hebrew Bible, each of which, that is, each of these witnesses, is at points and in varying degrees divergent from the text found in the foundational, revered Leningrad manuscript. Even within the Septuagint itself, we see evidence of more than one form of the text in the same book. There is an example in your handout, which I'm going to invite you on page 2. I'm not dealing with the handout yet, but do check with the second page with the quotation about the locks or the plaits or the braids, and look at LXXB and LXXA. The reason we have two forms of the text is that to this day, no one has been able to decide for sure how those readings relate to each other on the one hand, and how they relate to what is reflected in the Leningrad Codex. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Now then, given this history, which you should have known anyway, because you're smart and very learned young people. I can say young now. I used to be young once, but now when I say young, I say it with an authority. You are young people, with a few exceptions. I have some colleagues here now. Come on. Given this history, then, why is the retroverted Hebrew behind the Septuagint not preferred or used, whether for confessional or scholarly purposes, by a vast majority of users? Why is the Septuagint usually perceived and described as a version of and not a witness to the text of the Hebrew Bible? Now, I'm going to suggest that the answer is pretty simple. Three parts of the answer. First, canonization. Second, politics. And third, the power of tradition. I'm looking at the clock, and I realize that each of these I will not be able to develop as fully as I would like, but I would only remind you again of the King James Version of the Bible. We know a lot about the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have learned a lot about Greek manuscripts, and I will say with a fair degree of certainty that the dominance of the King James Version in the globe is still very much unchallenged. Now, several of us no longer speak 17th century English, but there's a tradition out there that if you say thee, you are closer to the divine than if you say you. And it was standard speech, as you should know, or well know, in the 17th century, to say, thou. But as much as we have learned over the years, the hegemony, if you will, or the dominance of that version has not been seriously challenged. That's just the way it is. Traditions die hard. Now, let me say a quick word on canonization. It is very unpleasant to have multiple forms of Scripture. And so sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, clerics of one kind or the other, mostly Jewish we think, decided to abandon or to marginalize all but one version of the Hebrew Scripture. And hence we have the expression, the received text. This text tracks more closely to the Hebrew of the St. Petersburg Codex, about which I've been speaking, than to the Hebrew text behind the Greek Bible, or for that matter, to any of the other early witnesses to the text of the Hebrew Bible, the Aramaic Targumim, the Samaritan Pentateuch, or what we can recover of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, let me make one point clear. We aren't talking about humongous, radical differences. All of the tradents of this material were shooting at the same target. It just seems that they got there differently. And I always try to remind people at this stage, they aren't doing anything new or revelatory. Read 1 Chronicles, read the books of Chronicles against Samuel Kings, and you will see that already in the Hebrew Bible you had alternate versions of the same story. If you read about David in Chronicles, you will find a very different portrayal of that person in Chronicles than you find in 2 Kings. So the notion of multiple forms of a text is, on reflection, not as radical as it might first appear. However, as I suggested, people need a single text. They don't want to have variants, and they don't want to have their heads hurt when they engage in a devotional or religious exercises. However, when one examines the texts of the Septuagint, especially of the Pentateuch, one finds numerous instances where the Hebrew from which the Septuagint was translated, the Hebrew underlying the Septuagint, and here's a word, if you're going on to graduate school, you better know it. It's vorlage, V-O-R-L-A-G-E. Everybody doesn't talk about the parent text. This shows that you're sophisticated. Anyway, is demonstrably clearer and less obscure in comparison with that of the so-called received text. Furthermore, there are places where it can unquestionably be shown that the Hebrew text of the Leningrad Codex is subsequent to that of the text behind the Septuagint. That is to say, it is easier and simpler to explain how the text of the Leningrad Codex, the received text, could have derived from the parent text of the Greek than the other way around. The Hebrew parent text of the Greek Bible, for which I am making a case again, Eric, not only clarifies ambiguities and absurdities in the received text, but it also diverges in significant ways from it. We discuss briefly each of these then in turn. Now, officially, we come to the handout. On your handout then are a few well-known examples where the Greek clarifies obscure passages in Hebrew. Everything in the handout is conveniently in English. I did not realize I had such a band of intellectuals in my audience. My host said they were undergraduates, but there aren't many undergraduates who both know Hebrew and Greek to whom I lecture. And so I thought of that fact when I put the handout together. But then I had another thought, and so you do have at least the text of the Leningrad Codex in your second handout. Now, everything in the handout then, as I said, is in English. The JPS Tanakh translation titled The Jewish Study Bible, and you should get that if you just want to see what the Leningrad Codex says. That's the book to use. So I'm using that as a proxy for what obtains in the Leningrad Codex. The next translation, of which I'm intimately aware, because I participated in producing it, as you know, is used to represent the Hebrew underlying the Septuagint, even though, in many cases, transliterated proper Hebrew nouns reflect the Greek and not the Hebrew forms. The RSV, NRSV, and I don't know what is your convention here in this beautiful campus. When you read Scripture in English, what is the traditional form of Scripture that you use? I'm not accustomed to lecturing without response, so this is my moment. Somebody speak to me. Huh? You still use the King James. So my prior point was cogent, I hope. In other Protestant circles, however, the Revised Standard Version in liberal Protestantism, and surely the New Revised Standard Version, is generally accepted as the preferred text. So I've included the RSV, the NRSV. Sorry, I didn't include the King James. Didn't know this. And I would not say anything bad about the King James from here on in. All right. All right. The RSV and RSV include examples of fusion between these two forms of the text, usually for the benefit of confessional, not scholarly communities. Let me just say another quick word on that. Believing communities usually demand translations that make sense, even if or when the original from which the translation is being made is obscure or ambiguous. So in the notes to the Revised Standard Version, and sometimes even in the notes to the King James Version, if you have one with red letter or margins, you'll see little notes. Well, here's my credit to the KJV. Things that are not in Hebrew, it will routinely put in italics. And there are times when you will find a note, Hebrew obscure, right? But the point is, the RSV and the NRSV tend to gloss that over by printing a text which at points is fusing what's in the Septuagint with what's in the Leningrad Codex. Now, let me just get to the end of this, because I'm having too much fun with you. You're a wonderful audience. I'm having fun, and I still have 20 minutes, so I'll be fine. Now, the NIV represents a free, somewhat inconsistent text. Sometimes it reflects the Leningrad Codex. Other times it prints reading drawn from the versions when the so-called Masoretic text is demonstrably flawed. It goes its own way. And at this point, I'm going to depart from my printed text and walk through some of this material with you. And I haven't scripted this, so we'll just see how it goes. On page 1, the first page, all of you should know that as early as Genesis 4:8, we have this sort of non sequitur. When you read the text in the Leningrad Codex, it says, Cain said to his brother. Those of you who read the Hebrew would realize that it is not told. The verb there is a very, it occurs ad nauseum throughout the Hebrew Bible. So clearly something is not there. Now, the Hebrew behind the Septuagint, as you should know, clearly reflects what I would just consider a more reasonable. I don't like to use moral judgments, but it says, and we did this, Cain said to his brother, let us go through into the plain. And of course the RSV and RSV says, let us go out to the field. I'll be curious, and I wish I knew that you were KJV. I would have included it, because you can go from 4 to 5 boxes. Where's my tech persons? You can just stick it in there somewhere. The point is, however, nowhere in the Hebrew text that we have extant do we know that he said, let us go out into the field. You can double check that. Let me go to one of my favorite examples. I discussed this in that other venue. The Deuteronomy 30 passage. And I'll just say a little bit about it. I've set before you this day life and prosperity, death and adversity. For I command you this day to love the Lord your God. Now, if you read it quickly, it doesn't seem to be illogical. Because Deuteronomy is a book that repeats those phrases over and over again. When you look at it in Hebrew, however, you'd realize that they're playing fast and loose with a preposition. The asher particle, where are my Hebraists? See what I'm talking about? Clearly suggests that something isn't quite right. I've laid out those differences for you onto the nets block. RSV and the NRSV have adopted it, but you can look over and see that the NIV says essentially what the Hebrew of the Codex Leningrad says, for I command you today to love your God. I will just leave that at that point. But let me get to the Samson passage. That's on page 2. I thought for a while of doing a PowerPoint thing, but those pretty arrows that you point, etc. When I'm listening to a presentation, like to have something on which I can scribble. So I did this old school thing of actually giving you a piece of paper so that you can scribble things on. So I want to walk you through some of this just a little bit. Everyone knows the story of Samson and Delilah. Here's what we have in Hebrew. 13b. I'm reading JPS first. You have been deceiving me all along. You have been lying to me. Tell me how you could be tied up. Then we go to the B part. He answered her, if you weave 7 locks of my head into the web. Now, whether in Hebrew, Greek, English, or otherwise, that makes no sense. And then it goes on, and she pinned it. Question, is it the web? What is the last singular noun before that it? She pinned it with a peg and cried to him, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. Now, I particularly like this example because it shows you in graphic form the challenges that those of us who work with texts face regularly. Now, LXXB and LXXA are printed in nets in parallel columns precisely because the task is great, but the laborers are few. No one has as yet resolved the challenges you face in several books of the Septuagint in which the major textual traditions are so divergent that they cannot be easily harmonized. So let's look for a quick minute, on the readings between B and A on the nets, and ask, if you had to choose, well, clearly I'm presuming that you would agree that what's in the Leningrad Codex is unfeasible, is untenable, and therefore the RSV. In fact, even the NIV, which I tell you goes back and forth, has piggybacked upon the readings in the Septuagint. Are you following me? Am I making this clear enough? All right. So you can go through and sort of cherry pick the words. Look, for example, on the third line. We have deceiving, told me lies, deceived me, mocked me, making a fool. Of the 5 witnesses I have across. I'm doing text criticism in English. If you had to make a choice, there's only one text we need to read. We don't want to read 5. You will have to go through a process, a protocol, to decide how you would have arrived at the one you decided to print. Now, let me go to the core of this. I telegraphed this question, so I have to ask it. Now, those of you who know Hebrew and Greek, you would note that in LXXB, the version of the young woman, I presume she was young, who was Samson's companion, is spelt Dalida. And in LXXA, it is Delilah. Now, here's my question. Here's the professor and me. At what stage in the development of these texts, now here they are in Greek, but I have made the point that they were more than likely translating a Hebrew manuscript. So the variation in the spelling of this popular word could have occurred at 2 stages. Could have been at the Hebrew stage or the Greek stage. So let me see what do you think. At what stage do you think the variation between the li, da, and the lila occurred? Hebrew or Greek?
In the Greek, the lambda and the delta are fairly similar in Greek, but in Hebrew they're pretty easy to tell apart.
So your conclusion is, send him off to a good graduate school. This is a good man. There you go. Precisely. Now, since you're so on point, in what kind of Greek? You know, Greek can be written in majuscule. You are doubly eligible to go to graduate school. He's making a very important point. The delta, the lambda, and the alpha are all shaped roughly the same way in the square series. So, in majuscule. And so if they're being written on a line, if the text is being written on a line, you could easily see that. So don't lose any sleep on that one. There are many more things in those variations that about which you can lose sleep, and I really am tempted to move on. Let me just say one other quick thing here. Note that only in LXXA, and his strength was not known, at the very end, does that appear. There's a challenge here. Someone has to decide. But let me just make this related point. When you read on the electronic versions, the Septuagint, more often than not, people are going to pick B, and there are all kinds of interesting things that need to be worked through before you decide even what the Greek says. So I'm using this to make several points, but I'm only halfway through, so let me move on. That's only page 2 of the handout, and I'm still halfway through my stuff, so we're going to have to move along here. Now, let's get to 1 Samuel, which everyone knows has all kinds of interesting things. 1 Samuel 10:1, a flask of oil Samuel took, poured some on Saul's head, and kissed him and said, "The Lord anoints you ruler over his people." And that's what you have accepted when you leave here. Now, you see there's a huge difference between what the next translation in English says. It provides the reason or the context into which his anointing as king should fit. I'm just going to have you look over that yourself because I'm trying to hurry along here. Now, the same thing. And, Urim and Thummim should go very well here. Right? Do you say Urim and Thummim? What do you say? Yeah, I was giving you Hebrew vocalizations of the word. But here's the deal. In the revered Masoretic text, what we have, Saul said to the Lord, the God of Israel, "Show Tamim." And then we have Jonathan and Saul were indicated by lot, and the troops were cleared. That's it. Now, this has long been known, but if you look at what the Septuagint has, it's a much fuller, clearer, I would just say more substantive, if you will, tradition reflected there. And, of course, that's picked up by the Revised Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version, and, of course, the NIV goes its own way on this one. But the point I want to also make here very quickly is on the nets, and that's on that second block, we find that the Hebrew words Urim and Thummim are translated in Greek. So you find show clear ones and show holiness. So there are times when they translate, there are times when they transliterate, depending on the view. Now, much and all as I'd like to go through the final 2 pages here, I'm going to have to maybe just pick one. That you know, or you should know, that there were times when the divine name is not translated, but it is substituted by a kind of euphemism. And the point I would like to make, and some of you who would come to dinner tonight, I'm happy to discuss this in greater detail, is that you would find that the Hebrew has rock, where the Greek has God. I'll try to truncate this. The only way you can explain how rock would be original and not God would be because you just think that the something written in Hebrew is sacrosanct. These are very interesting and detailed points. I would simply suggest, and I would be happy to develop this more fully if I had more time, that everything you find to the left of page 4 makes better sense. That is to say, we have editorial activity on the part of the tradition behind the Hebrew, and the fuller forms are in the Greek. Just read what's in the JPS and you'll find, this makes no sense. O nations, acclaim his people, for he'll avenge the blood of his servants, wreak vengeance on his foes, and cleanse the land of his people. Just simple logic would indicate to you that something is weird here. And the one line I want to pick from the second one is, how could one have routed 1,000 or 2 put 10,000 to flight unless their rock had sold them? The Lord had given them up. For their rock is not like our rock. Now, my point is, just as in the Psalter, we can see clearly instances where Yud-He Vav-He is replaced by Elohim in the so-called Elohistic Psalter. Are some of you following me? You know what I'm talking about here? We have an analogous situation here. Someone did not any longer want to articulate or vocalize the divine name, and they gave a substitute. But in this instance, they just saw Elohim as a descriptor for the deities of the nations. And they say, rock anyway, let's just put it on in there. And that's an interesting example of that. All right. These examples that I've discussed so far show the antiquity or the prior condition of the text behind the Septuagint, and may well indicate a clear form. I'm going to have to just leave all the good things I had on that page aside, and I'm going to try to get to this because I do want to hear from you. Now, here are some comments then about translating a translation. I'm editing on the fly. Translation, as you know, is an act of presumption. It's an act of hubris. Greek guys, you know hubris. Because every translator is engaging in a level of interpretation and commentary and reflecting his or her biases. First order translating then, let's say from Hebrew to Latin or Hebrew to Greek, generates its unique problems. As you should know, some verbal and nominal systems in certain languages are simpler than others. And so when you're translating, say, from Hebrew into Greek, and in my Septuagint seminar, that's something the students always have to do. You just have how many forms of the verb in which it appears. I was trained to say yiktol forms, right? Forms that are preformative. Are you with me here? And those that are afformative, So you have katal forms and yiktol forms. Everybody still with me here? That's it. And you have to say future, continuous present, he used to, he would, he will, right? And it's just a yiktol form. In Greek, of course, as you know, you have all this stuff that drives you crazy when you're learning it for the first time, right? All of these ways. So that's one of the challenges you face. Now, you have other kinds of challenges. I'm going to try to speed up here. You'll have, in Hebrew, 8 or 9 different synonyms for, let's say, a word like destroy, right? You shall do this, and you shall smack him, and you shall smite him, and you shall. Now, if you try to find English or Greek nuanced nouns or verbs to represent each of those overlapping forms in Hebrew, then people will say, what is he trying to do? So many translators just level it out. Just say, anytime I see the word for kill, the word for destroy, the word for whatever, I'm just going to give you one English or one Greek equivalent. So that's semantic leveling. Now, there are times when people say, this is boring, I'm just going to give you lots of different Greek words or lots of different English words, as the case may be, in the translation language. So you see, these are the things that we work through all the time. One other quick thing about translating, what I call first order translating, this is so foundational. One has to decide whether they are going to take the interests of the parent language as their primary concern and reflect as accurately as one can what's there, or one says, I am writing to 21st century sophisticated people, and I want them to be clear as to what it is I'm trying to say. So this whole dynamic equivalence versus formal equivalence thing is a big, big deal. And very few people are either one or the other, but that's one of the challenges. Now, with second order translation, by that I mean you're translating a translation, you have all kinds of additional challenges. And I am between a rock and a hard place on this because all my good stuff is still to come. And I'm told you go in 5 minutes. You can't go in 5 minutes. Now, with second order translations then, the level of challenge increases, especially when the second order translator, someone like myself or anyone who is translating the Septuagint, knows both Hebrew and Greek and the English language into which we are translating the material. Here's an excellent example of one of those challenges. Proper names. And this is perhaps all I can get here. The Hebrew word Pelishtim, the Philistines, as you know them, is routinely translated, not transliterated in the Septuagint as olophiloi, other groups, other tribes. The translator of Netz then has this challenge, either deciding whether to further translate into English, olophiloi, saying other tribes, or to revert to the Hebrew term Pelishtim, because everybody knows who the Philistines are, and transliterate that Hebrew, which the Greek translator translated. Am I losing you? I hope not. Or, as we did in Netz, decided to transliterate the Greek translation and come up with a neologism like allophiles. And so when you read the example in Nets on page 2, you will find it says the allophiles are upon you. I'm going to skip all the other things here. There are a bunch of other things that we struggle with when we are engaging in translation. I therefore then, I'm going to bring a coda to all of this, invite you to read carefully the introductory materials in the New English translation of the Septuagint. And we discussed there, several of us, the various types of challenges to the reader and to the translator that we face. I'm anxious to field your questions. And therefore, let me just put the other end of the parenthesis on this. What's too painful to remember? Remember I told you that? We simply choose to forget. And it's my hope that as you proceed in your life here at this wonderful university, about which I'm only beginning to get an idea, that you do not forget the Septuagint. I am a salesperson for the Septuagint. Despite the pain it might entail for you to master Greek, those of you who haven't, or the discomfort the Septuagint might bring to you if yours is a simplistic version of the Bible or biblical textual history, I still encourage you to engage with it. If you cannot find time to master Greek, this Nets translation, to which I gave you just all too brief an introduction, should go a long way to introducing you to the rich resources found in the Septuagint. And as I told you, I edited out a lot of things. I'd love to field some of your reactions, questions, concerns, arrows, slings, whatever you have.